You seriously expect me to believe that your grandpa was a SEAL legend? The voice was sharp, mocking, filled with the arrogance only a young soldier could have. Emily Lawson stood her ground, trying not to let her hands shake. The group of soldiers in front of her laughed, their jeering voices echoing in the air. A few of them exchanged glances, their smirks growing as they eyed the worn photograph of her grandfather, Harrison Lawson, that she held tightly in her hand. It was an old picture, showing a young man in a military uniform, his face confident and strong, but to these soldiers, it might as well have been a relic from another century. They didn't know the truth about Harrison Lawson. They didn't know the history that ran through his veins. I'm telling you, he was the real deal. He was a legend, Emily insisted, her voice steady despite the mocking laughter. Yeah, right, one of the soldiers sneered. What's next? You gonna tell me he was on the moon too? A legend, huh? Another soldier, a grinning young man with a fresh shave and shiny boots, elbowed his friend. I've heard some tall tales, but this takes the cake. Emily's heart raced, but she refused to let her embarrassment show. She had heard these kinds of dismissive words before. It wasn't the first time someone had mocked her for speaking about her grandfather's service. But this time felt different. She could feel the weight of their judgment, the dismissive glances, and the judgment of these men who had never faced the challenges her grandfather had. He saved lives, she said quietly. A lot of them. And if you're so sure that you know everything, then ask the unit that served with him. Ask the men who were there. She was shaking now, but her voice remained firm, even if her hands betrayed her with their slight tremble. The soldiers laughed even louder, some of them shaking their heads in disbelief. Ask the unit? One of them scoffed. Who's gonna believe you, kid? You're just some girl making up stories. They turned to leave, continuing to laugh, but Emily remained rooted to the spot, clutching the photo of her grandfather with both hands. Just as she started to walk away, a heavy vehicle's engine rumbled from behind, cutting through the laughter. It was a noise that made everyone pause. The soldiers' laughter faltered. They turned, their faces frozen in disbelief as a convoy of military vehicles rolled into the base. The dust kicked up around the tires as the vehicles came to a stop, and from them, a group of men in tactical gear began to step out. They were older than the soldiers who had been mocking Emily, but their presence was undeniable. They moved with purpose, each step filled with a silent authority. Emily felt her heart skip a beat. Her eyes locked onto the leader of the group, and for the first time, she saw them, those same men she had spoken of, the men who had served with her grandfather. As the group approached, the first man to step forward was none other than Captain James Hunter Carter, his eyes scanning the area before resting on Emily. Is this the granddaughter of Harrison Lawson? His voice was commanding, and the soldiers who had mocked her fell silent. Emily nodded, her throat tight. The soldiers around her began to shift uncomfortably, their previous bravado melting away. Captain Carter's eyes softened as he looked at her. Your grandfather saved our lives, he said, his voice carrying the weight of years spent in combat. And anyone who doubts that doesn't know what it means to fight for something bigger than themselves. The soldiers who had laughed earlier now stood still, their eyes wide, their faces filled with shock. Emily looked at the photo of her grandfather one last time, her chest swelling with pride. Tell them, Captain, she whispered. Carter gave her a slight nod, and then, without a word, he turned to the young soldiers, his voice cutting through the air like a knife. This is Harrison Lawson's granddaughter. He's not a legend in our eyes, son. He's a brother, and you'd better show her the respect she deserves. The soldiers, their faces pale, snapped to attention as the weight of the words settled over them. The laughter was gone, replaced by an uncomfortable silence. Emily stood taller, her heart swelling with both pride and relief. Her grandfather's legacy had just been confirmed, and no one would ever mock her for speaking of it again. Emily stood silently, the weight of the situation settling around her. The group of soldiers, who had once mocked her for claiming her grandfather's legendary status, now stood in complete silence, their eyes wide as they absorbed the words of Captain Hunter Carter. His words had hit them hard, and in that moment, Emily could feel the shift, a change that had taken place in the air around them. The young soldiers, once so confident in their ridicule, were now uncertain. Their faces were no longer filled with laughter, but with genuine disbelief. Captain Carter's steady gaze swept over them, his presence commanding attention without a single harsh word. He knew the impact of his next actions, and with that knowledge, he spoke again, his voice unwavering. You think you know what it means to serve, but until you've walked the same ground as men like Harrison Lawson, you don't. His words hung in the air, thick with meaning. Emily could see the young soldiers shifting uncomfortably, their posture now stiff with respect. They weren't just facing an officer, they were facing the truth. One by one, their eyes dropped, unable to meet the gaze of the man who had just confirmed what they had once dismissed. They were no longer in the presence of a young woman who was making up stories, but of a woman whose grandfather had earned a place in history, a place that they would never fully understand. Captain Carter took a step forward, his boots crunching softly against the gravel, the sound a sharp contrast to the silence that had fallen over the group. He turned to Emily, his eyes softening, a silent gesture of approval passing between them. Your grandfather didn't just fight. He led. And that's why we're here. Emily swallowed, the emotions of the moment almost too much to bear. The words from Captain Carter had been the validation she needed, but it was more than just the validation. It was the respect, the acknowledgement that her grandfather's legacy was real and undeniable. The soldiers now stood at attention, their eyes no longer mocking but filled with a quiet understanding. He's a hero, one of them murmured, his voice barely audible. It wasn't loud, but it was enough. Emily didn't need grand gestures. She didn't need them to shout their apologies. All she needed was this moment where the truth had been spoken and where the respect she had fought for had been earned. We owe him everything, another soldier added, his voice steadier now, as if he had finally come to terms with the weight of the past. Emily nodded slightly, her heart swelling with pride. Thank you, she said quietly, but her words were meant for more than just Captain Carter. They were for the men who had served with her grandfather, for the legacy he had left behind, and for the respect he had earned, even if the world had been slow to recognize it. The group stood in silence for a moment longer, the reality of the situation settling in. It wasn't just the young soldiers who had changed, the entire atmosphere around them had shifted. The bond between them and the legacy of Harrison Lawson had been solidified, and in that quiet moment, Emily knew that her grandfather's name would never again be spoken with disrespect. The tension in the air had not yet settled when Captain Carter took one last look at the young soldiers. He had done what he needed to do, and now, it was time to let them process. The silence stretched on, each second filled with the weight of what had been said, what had been revealed. Emily stood there, her hands still clutching the photo of her grandfather, her mind racing with the realization that the men around her now knew the truth. They understood who Harrison Lawson was, not just a name, not just a story, but a man who had earned his place among the legends. The silence was broken when Lieutenant Mark Davis, one of the soldiers who had mocked her earlier, stepped forward hesitantly. He had been the most vocal in his skepticism, but now, there was something different in his demeanor. His head was bowed, his posture not quite at attention, but filled with something far more genuine. I didn't know, he muttered, his voice rough, as if the words were difficult for him to say. I didn't know who he really was. The others stood in silence, their eyes locked on Lieutenant Davis. Emily could see the shift in his eyes, the realization that he had misjudged not just her, but an entire generation of veterans who had lived through things he could never imagine. You should have, Captain Carter said, his voice quieter now, but no less firm. He looked at Lieutenant Davis, then back at the others. Harrison Lawson wasn't just a hero. He was a brother, and we owe him more than words can say. Emily's heart beat in her chest, a mixture of pride and relief washing over her. It wasn't about the apology. It wasn't about them acknowledging they were wrong. It was about the respect that had been earned, the truth that had been recognized. She felt a hand on her shoulder, and she looked up to find Captain Carter beside her, his expression soft. He would be proud of you, Emily, he said, his words simple but carrying the weight of years of experience. Emily nodded, blinking back the sudden surge of emotion. Thank you, she whispered, her voice tight. She couldn't find the right words, but somehow, thank you seemed enough. For a moment, the world seemed to slow. The soldiers stood around her, the weight of her grandfather's legacy now clear in their eyes. They were no longer the mocking group that had greeted her at the gate. They were changed. She was no longer the girl with a story to tell. She was the granddaughter of a man who had fought for a country that, until now, had forgotten his name. "I'll never forget what you've done for us," one of the soldiers said, his voice barely above a whisper. Emily turned toward him, her eyes meeting his, and in that brief exchange, she saw something she hadn't expected: sincerity. The group slowly began to disperse, each of the soldiers moving with a new sense of respect. The chatter of the base returned to its normal rhythm, but for Emily, the world had shifted. She wasn't just a granddaughter. She was now a part of something greater, a legacy that had been validated, a story that had been heard. And for the first time in a long time, she felt like she wasn't carrying the weight alone. As she walked away, the photo of her grandfather still clutched in her hand, she knew this moment would stay with her forever. The respect had been earned, the truth had been acknowledged, and the memory of Harrison Lawson would never again be questioned. The day after the encounter with Captain Carter, Emily walked across the base, her mind still processing everything that had happened. It was strange. There was a sense of calm that hadn't been there before. The usual noise of the base felt quieter, almost as if the ground she walked on had been changed, too. It was a strange feeling, this sense of quiet triumph. She wasn't walking into a crowd of mockers anymore. No one looked at her with suspicion or amusement. She was seen differently now. As she made her way to the small bench where she often sat to collect her thoughts, she saw Lieutenant Davis again. He was sitting by himself, his hands resting on his knees, his uniform crisp but with an air of discomfort. Emily hesitated for a moment before she approached him. She had no expectations, no desire for an apology, but there was something in the way he looked at her the day before that stayed with her. As she approached, Davis looked up, his expression guarded but not hostile. "I owe you an apology," he said, his voice steady, but with an underlying sincerity. Emily smiled slightly, shaking her head. "You don't owe me anything," she replied, sitting down beside him. "I don't need you to say sorry." But Davis insisted, "I do. I judged your grandfather. I judged you, without knowing a thing about either of you." Emily glanced over at him, noticing the weight of his words. There was no arrogance now, no sarcasm, just honesty. "He was a legend," Davis continued quietly. "I didn't get it until I saw the men who served with him. They didn't just respect him, they worshipped him. And now, I see why you're so proud of him." Emily looked down at the photo of her grandfather, still in her hands. She had carried it with her everywhere, and now, it felt heavier than ever. She didn't need to hear the words from Davis to know that things had changed. The respect that had been absent before was now there, plain and clear. But more than that, Emily realized that her grandfather's legacy wasn't just about the men who had served with him. It was about every person whose life had been touched by his service. Her grandfather had lived through things that were beyond most people's comprehension. And now, those who had once mocked him were coming to understand. "Thank you," she said softly. Davis looked over at her, his eyes softer than they had been. "I'm glad I could finally see it." "It's not just about seeing it," Emily said, her voice steady. "It's about recognizing it." And you did. There was a quiet moment between them as they both sat, the sound of the bass in the background, but neither of them seemed to mind the noise anymore. In that moment, everything felt right. Emily didn't need anyone else to believe in her grandfather. She didn't need their validation or approval. She had known who he was all along. And now, others were finally beginning to understand, too. As the afternoon sun began to dip lower in the sky, Emily stood up, feeling lighter than she had in a long time. She had carried her grandfather's legacy alone for so long, but now, it wasn't just hers anymore. It belonged to all the men and women who had served beside him, to all the people who would now look at his memory with respect. She smiled to herself as she walked away. The photo of Harrison Lawson still clutched tightly in her hand, and for the first time, she felt like she was walking in his footsteps, not just as his granddaughter, but as a keeper of his story, ready to share it with anyone who was willing to listen. Weeks passed, and Emily continued to walk through the base with a new sense of purpose. The once heavy weight of carrying her grandfather's legacy alone now felt lighter, shared by everyone who had come to understand who he truly was. The soldiers who had once dismissed her, who had mocked her claim that Harrison Lawson was a legend, were now different. They treated her with respect, even admiration, and it was clear that the atmosphere on base had shifted. No longer did she feel like an outsider with a story to tell. She was part of something bigger now. One afternoon, as she sat in the small diner on the base, she noticed Lieutenant Davis walking in, his steps hesitant, as if he was still unsure of how to approach her. Emily glanced up and offered a small smile, not because she expected anything from him, but because she had grown used to the quiet shift in the way he now carried himself. He had apologized, and that apology had meant more than any words she could say. "Mind if I join you?" Davis asked, his voice polite but laced with uncertainty. "Sure," Emily replied, her tone warm but not overly inviting. She didn't need him to feel sorry for her anymore. She just needed to keep moving forward. He slid into the seat across from her, looking slightly uncomfortable, but his posture was no longer the arrogant stance of the man who had once dismissed her so easily. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said," Davis began, breaking the silence between them. "About your grandfather." Emily nodded, her fingers tracing the rim of her coffee cup. "He wasn't just a soldier," Davis continued, his voice softening. "He was the kind of man who made the impossible seem possible. I didn't get that until I saw it for myself." Emily looked up at him, her gaze steady. "I'm glad you understand." Davis shifted slightly in his seat, then added, "It's funny, isn't it? How someone can walk into your life and change everything, without you even knowing it. I had no idea who he was, but now I know that man was a legend, and I've been walking around here, thinking I knew everything." Emily took a sip of her coffee, letting the silence settle in. There was no need for more words between them. Davis had come to understand what she had always known. Harrison Lawson wasn't just a name in a history book. He was a real man, someone who had lived through hell and come back, not to boast about it, but to quietly live out the rest of his days. "He taught us something," Davis said after a long pause. "Not just about what it means to serve, but about what it means to be a man. A good man." Emily felt a lump form in her throat, but she swallowed it down. "Yes," she whispered. "He did." The conversation drifted into quieter territory, but Emily knew the bond between her and Davis had shifted. It wasn't just an apology. It was understanding. Davis had come to realize that respect couldn't be demanded. It had to be earned. And her grandfather had earned that respect, not through medals or stories, but through the life he had lived and the legacy he had left behind. As the lunch crowd filtered in and out of the diner, Emily finished her meal in peace, no longer feeling the need to explain her grandfather's story to anyone. The truth had found its way to the surface, and those who needed to hear it had listened. The chapter of disbelief had closed, and with it, a new chapter had begun, one where Harrison Lawson's legacy wasn't just something to be proud of, but something to be honored, respected, and remembered. Weeks passed, and the changes Emily had felt began to settle into the rhythm of her daily life. The base no longer felt like a place where she had to fight for recognition or explain her grandfather's legacy. People respected her now, not just for who she was, but for what her grandfather had done. The soldiers who had once mocked her were now allies in a silent bond of understanding. Lieutenant Davis had become one of them, not just because of an apology, but because he had come to truly see what her grandfather had represented. Emily spent her mornings walking through the base, the same paths she had walked countless times before, but now with a quiet confidence that she hadn't known she had. She was no longer alone in her memory of Harrison Lawson. It felt as though the legacy he had left was no longer just hers to carry. It had been shared by so many. One afternoon, Emily sat in her usual spot, a bench near the edge of the training field where soldiers often came and went. As she watched them, it occurred to her how much the world had changed in such a short time. She felt connected to the place now, not just because of the respect her grandfather had earned, but because she had learned how to stand in his shadow, not as a burden, but as a part of something bigger. It was then that Captain Carter walked by, his usual serious demeanor softened by the warmth of a quiet smile when he saw her. He stopped, his eyes meeting hers. "How's everything, Emily?" he asked, his tone genuine. "Good," she replied, offering him a smile in return. "Better, actually. Thanks to you." Captain Carter gave a small nod, acknowledging the unspoken truth that hung between them. "You've earned it," he said simply. "Not just for yourself, but for him. For Harrison." Emily didn't need any more words. She knew what he meant. It had been hard for her, standing up and claiming the legacy of someone who had given so much and received so little in return. But now it was different. The soldiers who had once thought her delusional were now the ones who sought her out. They listened when she spoke, they respected the stories she told, and more than that, they cared. "I'm proud of you, Emily," Captain Carter said, his voice steady. "You did more than just prove something to them. You proved it to yourself." Emily nodded, feeling a sense of peace settle in her chest. She wasn't just the granddaughter of a legend anymore. She was someone who had made that legend real again, someone who had turned the story into a living truth. As the day went on, Emily found herself walking through the base once more, this time with a new perspective. The base, once filled with voices that doubted her, now felt like home, a place where she no longer had to fight for recognition. It was as though the entire world had shifted to acknowledge the strength of the man who had shaped her, and the strength she had discovered in herself. There was no longer any need to convince anyone of who her grandfather was. They knew now, and so did she. Harrison Lawson's legacy wasn't just a story she carried. It was a part of who she was, and it would live on, not only in her, but in everyone who had come to understand the man he truly was. The base had changed in more ways than one. Emily could feel it every time she walked through the streets, passing by soldiers who once ignored her or made snide comments. Now, there was nothing but respect in their eyes. The jokes had stopped, replaced by nods of acknowledgement, quiet conversations, and sometimes even smiles. It wasn't just the men who had mocked her in the past who had changed. It was the entire atmosphere of the base. Everyone had heard the stories about Harrison Lawson. Everyone had come to understand that he wasn't just a name or a legend. They had seen the impact he had on the men who served with him, the men who had lived through the same hardships and trials. It was clear now that Harrison Lawson's legacy was not just a whisper in the wind. It was a foundation that everyone around her now stood upon. Emily found herself walking to the same bench she always did, the one that sat on the edge of the training field. As she sat down, she pulled out the worn photograph of her grandfather from her bag. The edges were frayed, the ink slightly faded, but the image of her grandfather, strong and resolute, was still clear. She had never stopped carrying it with her, even when the world around her doubted the truth she held. Now, as she gazed at the photograph, she felt a deep sense of pride. She wasn't just carrying his memory, she was living it, breathing it, and sharing it with others. It was no longer just her story to tell. It was everyone's story. Lieutenant Davis approached her one afternoon, his steps more confident than before. He didn't hesitate as he walked up to her, the same sense of respect in his eyes that had replaced the arrogance that once defined him. "I've been thinking about something," he said, his voice steady but filled with sincerity. Emily looked up at him, her heart lighter than it had ever been. "What's that?" "I owe you more than just an apology," he said, his words measured but honest. "I've been going through some of the old reports, trying to piece together what made your grandfather so special, and I've realized that I've spent so much of my life thinking I knew what it meant to be a soldier." He paused, his gaze never leaving hers. "I had no idea. I didn't understand the sacrifices, the depth of commitment. But your grandfather, he showed me what it really meant to serve, to truly serve." Emily felt her chest tighten, not with sorrow, but with gratitude. It was one thing to have someone acknowledge your grandfather's legacy in passing, but to have them recognize the full weight of it, that was something else entirely. "Thank you," she said softly, though the words felt small in the face of everything she had experienced. "You don't have to thank me," Davis replied, shaking his head. "I should have known better. But I get it now. I understand what he gave up, what he went through, and I finally see why you carry that picture with you everywhere." Emily smiled, the connection between them unspoken but clear. It wasn't about the apology. It wasn't about the recognition. It was about understanding. "He was a hero," Davis added, his voice quieter now, as if the weight of the truth had settled on his shoulders. "Not because he had medals or accolades, but because he gave everything for the people around him. That's the real legacy." Emily didn't say anything in response. She didn't need to. The respect was there now. The truth had been acknowledged, not just by Davis, but by everyone on the base. The ones who had once mocked her were now the ones who stood in silent recognition. As Davis turned to leave, he gave her a small nod. She watched him walk away, feeling a quiet sense of fulfillment. She wasn't just Harrison Lawson's granddaughter anymore. She was a part of his legacy, and that was enough. Emily had started to feel a strange peace in the days that followed her conversation with Lieutenant Davis. The weight of the world that had once rested heavily on her shoulders seemed to lift, slowly but surely. The soldiers who had once doubted her now approached her with the kind of respect she had always hoped for but never expected. It wasn't just lip service, it was real. They understood her grandfather's legacy, and with that understanding came a quiet reverence for everything he had done. The transformation wasn't just happening among the soldiers. It was happening inside of her as well. Emily had always been proud of her grandfather, but she had never truly realized how much of his legacy had been left for her to carry. Now, with the weight of that legacy shared by so many others, it felt lighter. It felt like something she didn't have to prove anymore. It felt like a part of her, not something separate she had to defend. One day, as Emily walked through the base on her way to the training field, she noticed a small crowd gathered near the gates. Curious, she moved closer and saw the familiar figure of Captain Carter standing at the center, speaking to a group of soldiers. As she approached, he noticed her and motioned her over. "Emily," he said, his tone warm. "Glad to see you. We were just talking about Harrison." Emily smiled, nodding in acknowledgement. She had come to think of Captain Carter as an ally, someone who had not only seen the truth about her grandfather, but also shared that truth with everyone else. "What's going on?" she asked, her curiosity piqued. Captain Carter glanced at the group, then back at Emily. "We've been talking about some of the lessons your grandfather taught us. Lessons we didn't fully understand until we walked in his footsteps. They want to hear more about him, from you." Emily's heart skipped a beat. She had shared her grandfather's story before, but this felt different. It felt like an invitation, not just to tell a story, but to pass on a piece of history. "You sure?" she asked, hesitating for a moment. I'm not sure what they'll get out of it." "They'll get more than you think," Captain Carter replied, his smile warm and encouraging. "Your grandfather's story doesn't just belong to you anymore. It belongs to all of us." Emily took a deep breath, her nerves tingling with the thought of speaking in front of so many people. But she knew this wasn't about her. This was about her grandfather's legacy, his lessons, his sacrifices, his life. And she wasn't just carrying it for herself anymore. She was carrying it for them too. She stepped forward, joining the circle of soldiers, and began to speak. As she shared the stories of her grandfather, of his quiet strength, of his loyalty to his brothers in arms, of the sacrifices he had made, she felt something shift inside her. It wasn't just the pride she had always carried. It was a deeper connection to the men and women around her. They listened intently, hanging on every word, and when she finished, the silence that followed was heavy, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was respectful. The soldiers nodded, their eyes filled with understanding, and some even offered small words of gratitude. "He was one of a kind," one of the soldiers said quietly. "We get it now. Thank you for sharing that," another added. "We'll carry those lessons with us." Emily smiled, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. She hadn't expected anything, but in that moment, she realized that the legacy of Harrison Lawson wasn't just something that would fade away. It wasn't just a story that would be told and forgotten. It would live on, in the hearts of everyone who had come to understand what it meant to serve, to sacrifice, and to live with honor. She had shared his story, and in doing so, she had ensured that his legacy would never be forgotten. As time passed, the base continued to shift in subtle, yet significant ways. Emily noticed the changes not just in the way people treated her, but in how they spoke about her grandfather. Harrison Lawson had become a name that carried weight, not just in her heart, but in the hearts of every soldier and officer who had once doubted him. They now spoke of him with reverence, and his story had woven itself into the fabric of the base's history. Emily no longer had to explain who he was or justify why his legacy mattered. It was understood. One afternoon, Captain Carter approached her as she sat on her usual bench by the training field. He stood there for a moment, watching her with a quiet smile, and then sat down beside her. "You've done something remarkable, Emily," he said, his tone filled with appreciation. Emily turned to him, surprised. "What do you mean?" she asked. "You've brought your grandfather's story back to life," he said, his voice steady. "You didn't just share it with us. You made us believe in it again. Made us understand that his sacrifice, his commitment, wasn't just a part of history. It's a part of who we are now." Emily looked down at the photo of her grandfather in her hand. The edges were still frayed, the ink still slightly faded, but it didn't matter. The image of Harrison Lawson had become more than just a picture. It had become a symbol, one that connected everyone around her. It was a symbol of sacrifice, of honor, and of the quiet strength that defined her grandfather. I never expected anything like this, Emily said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. I just wanted people to understand who he was. And they do, Captain Carter replied. They understand, and they respect him. They respect you. Emily's chest tightened with emotion. She had spent so much time feeling like she was carrying the weight of her grandfather's memory alone. But now, it felt like that weight was shared by so many. It was no longer just her burden. It was a part of the legacy that lived on in everyone who had come to know Harrison Lawson's story. Thank you, she whispered, her voice thick with gratitude. Captain Carter nodded, his eyes softening. Thank you for sharing it. For making sure we remember. As he stood to leave, Emily sat there for a long moment, letting the silence settle around her. She had come a long way from the days when she first stepped onto the base, carrying nothing but a photograph and a story to tell. Now, she had more than just memories. She had a community that understood, that respected, and that carried her grandfather's legacy alongside her own. And for the first time in a long time, Emily felt like she wasn't alone. Harrison Lawson's story was no longer just something she carried. It was something everyone now shared, something that would never be forgotten. The base felt like home, and her place within it was no longer uncertain. She had found her peace, and with that, she knew that the legacy of Harrison Lawson would live on, not just in the history books, but in the hearts of all who served with honor.